Welcome to this benchmark video. We're recording at our conference, Giga USA at Washington, DC. For this video, I'm joined by Craig Shesky, the CFO at the metals company. Craig, how are you doing? Are you enjoying the conference?
Enjoying it very much, yeah. We've done this now a couple of years in a row, and it's certainly been interesting to see the narrative evolve over the last few years, and I think it's just showing a lot of the tailwinds in particular for deep sea bed nodules.
Yeah. We'll learn more today about the metals company, about deep sea mining. But first I would like to start with you. Could you tell more about yourself, your professional journey, and basically how you ended up at the metals company?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been in and around metals all my life, intentionally or otherwise. I grew up in northern Michigan, and my father worked for the Cleveland Cliffs mines up there in iron ore mining. My brother worked for the mines. I, in fact, worked for the mines during college. A large open pit iron ore operation, Empire and Tilden. And I've always been fascinated by the metals industry. I went to New York to actually work in investment banking at Morgan Stanley for a couple of years. Okay. And then spent 12 years at King Street Capital, a $20 billion hedge fund in New York, and ended up covering eventually metals and mining. So in trying to answer the question of what investments should we make in this space, I became very intrigued by some of the long-term supply issues that were clearly coming for metals like copper and nickel and cobalt and manganese. And in 2019, I had the opportunity to meet the CEO of Deep Green, which was the predecessor company to the metals company prior to us going public. I'll be honest, I was skeptical at first about the idea that you have all of these polymetallic nodules, these little potato-sized rocks, or smaller than a potato actually, laying on top of the seafloor in this one area of the Pacific Ocean where they're in high abundance, and they have high grades of nickel, copper, cobalt, and manganese all rolled into one. So while I was skeptical, I did a lot of work, and then about 6 months later, invested in the company when it was still private through an SPV. Okay. And then I joined the company full-time in 2021. Okay. So
that's pretty recent. I thought it was,
yeah. Well, the company's been around for 15 years. I've been the CFO for a little over 5 years.
Okay.
But yeah, it's a long journey to get this place, and actually the industry itself has had a journey of about 50 or 60 years, going back to some of the U.S. pioneers who started collecting nodules in the 1970s.
Okay. I think you touched upon this in the introduction. So we've seen a shifting narrative here in the United States, especially from going to the Biden administration to this administration, from, let's say, the framing around minerals being before more around EVs, batteries, now much more about AI. Still batteries, energy storage, and defense. Has this shifted your business case? To what extent has it shifted your business case? How are you looking at these new demand drivers?
It has shifted the narrative. And I don't say that as in we're marketing two new demand sources. This is the supply side issue. And it's the fact that not only are the supply of these metals coming from specifically difficult jurisdictions, such as nickel. 2/3 of nickel supply comes from Indonesia, coming from the most biodiverse rainforest on the planet. Most cobalt supply comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo. So on the demand side, investors often take a hold of the EV story or the defense story or AI, data centers, and that's all great. But back when I was a resource analyst, the supply side really tells the tale, because there will always be new demand drivers. Typically, if you go back for the last 150 years, copper tends to grow with GDP. For nickel, actually, most demand comes from stainless steel, and that's a GDP plus type. It's stable. Manganese, which is nearly a third of our future revenue, that's necessary in the production of carbon steel, so any steel that's not stainless. So you can think of us really as potentially selling in the steel market, selling for defense applications. The copper is used in everything. So while the demand side gets a lot of the headlines, analysts who really want to understand the story should look at the supply side. And that's one where over the last 20 years, particularly in base metals like nickel and copper, there has been underinvestment from many of the large diversified producers. So there's this interesting dynamic where you see many of the folks speaking here today understand the demand side is going in the right direction, but many of the large miners are keeping their exploration CapEx budgets relatively low. And that's been consistent for the last 15 years. I recall in 2011 and 2012, when I was covering this industry, there were many who were more than happy, because copper prices started sliding in 2011, to keep their shovels out of the ground and just wait for prices to rise. That's particularly important for metals like copper and nickel, where the average time to development from discovery to production is 15 to 20 years. So this isn't something that can then correct on the dime just with permit reform or a very encouraging political regime. It's something where you would have had to been putting in place all of the exploration budgets and the development 15 years ago. And that's exactly what TMC has been doing. We have been developing this resource of nodules for the last 15 years. We've spent over $700 million. And while there are many new entrants to the space, many of which are at this conference, it's that head start that is really tough to replicate. And we just so happen to have been in that good position, pushing this industry forward beginning in 2011.
So although we've seen a shift from energy transition to energy security, you're saying we're looking at the long term, and from a long-term perspective, will not change fundamentally.
Exactly. We're looking in the long term. And, the supply side here, it's a very large ship with a small rudder. It can't turn that quickly, for good and for bad. And for now that you see the pipeline of new potential investments just not keeping up with the pace of demand, that's setting up very well for anybody who has a resource like TMC does, just sitting on the seafloor waiting to get picked up.
Yeah. Cool. There's a lot of focus on TMC as a company, but you guys are dependent on the whole ecosystem to make deep sea mining happening in the short to medium term. Looking at your equipment side, the collection system, you work together. You've got a partnership with Allseas.
Yes.
Can you perhaps talk a little bit more about this partnership, about the collection, the collection system, and also the next steps that need to be addressed to go to a commercial status?
Yeah, well, the basic collection system is similar to the collection systems proven in the 1970s by companies like Lockheed Martin, U.S. Steel, BP, Shell. Think of it as a offshore oil and gas drill ship, and we have that, a Samsung 10,000 vessel called the Hidden Gem. Our partner Allseas bought that in 2020, and by early 2022, they had the collector fabricated and it was doing tests in the deep ocean. So the turnaround time is relatively quick compared to the development timeline for a land-based metals project. That drill ship is then, let's say this is the surface, it's connected via 4,000 meter riser pipe, and then you have a little collector on the seafloor picking up these rocks, and it moves at about 1 mile per hour over time. So think of it effectively as a very slow-moving but continuous mining system. So the collector picks up the nodules, very similar to golf balls being picked up on a driving range. There is no digging, there's no blasting, there's no drilling. We can actually process the nodules with no tailings. So there are a lot of environmental advantages. The biggest advantage comes from the fact that when you're in this deep part of the ocean, there's very little life per square meter. There is life, 80% of it by biomass is bacteria, but there's less to disturb, so that's why the impacts are a far cry from, let's say, digging up a forest and affecting all of the macrofauna and people that happen to live there. So our partner Allseas developed this collection system building on some of that pioneering work. One of the important things that we announced in May was the fact that TMC and Allseas now have a commercial agreement together that will dictate the terms by which we are operating together and paying them a per ton fee to collect the nodules, and then we take them, bring them to shore. But Allseas and TMC will also be sharing the pre-production development costs, some of which has already been spent. But there had been a pause where TMC and Allseas were waiting for progress from the regulator, the International Seabed Authority. Since then, of course, it's well known that we pivoted to the existing U.S. legal regime administered by NOAA, and that is the regime that will give us our permit, we anticipate, in the first quarter of 2027. So TMC and Allseas are beginning to get that system ready for commercial operations. We will add a second collector vehicle on the seafloor. We'll put in place a wider riser pipe to allow more nodules to go up. But these basic engineering upgrades will be funded together by TMC and Allseas, and it's a relatively small amount. In low hundreds of millions of dollars. But it's important to note that Allseas is a 15% shareholder in TMC. So we're very much aligned. So it's not really contract mining, it's us in partnership with Allseas pioneering this step, and then you go to the second vessel, and then the third, the fourth, the fifth. It's not like land-based mining where in a brownfield development you kind of have to drag the infrastructure with you.
Multiple vessels then.
Correct. There's no real limiting factor other than the mine plan approved by the regulator to how many vessels you can put on the sea.
And can you put a timeline on this in terms of when the system will be ready and to enable you to start?
Absolutely. We anticipate commissioning in the fourth quarter of 2027.
Okay, that's quick.
Yeah, it's pretty quick. But then again, that's based on development that we already did in 2021 and 2022. So a lot of that has been well in hand. In fact, the person at Allseas who designed our collector vehicle, Rutger Boseland, now works at TMC. So there's a very strong working relationship between both companies. But I think it shows a confidence that we have in Allseas and the confidence that Allseas has in us and this U.S. permitting timeline, because they would not be spending that money on their own balance sheet if they did not believe the permit was coming.
Yeah.
So I think that signal shows their confidence and our confidence that this NOAA permit is coming in really less than 9 months from today.
Yeah. We'll talk about the legal stuff in a moment, but again, talking about the ecosystem you guys are building, another component is the onshore stuff, the processing. It's the biggest bottleneck, not only for, to put it in a wider context, to break China's dominance in the critical mineral space. Processing is the one that needs to be addressed. How are you guys planning to address that, to pick up the nodules and then to process them onshore? Can you tell us a bit about your plans in that regard?
Absolutely. And while China has dominated the processing of many of these metals, let's take a step back. The U.S., why does the U.S. want to do this? Why do cabinet departments focus so much on this industry? Why did the executive order from President Trump, signed in April of last year, why did it direct the Department of War and Commerce and Energy to focus their energy on this space? The reason is that the U.S. has very little or no primary production domestically for nickel, cobalt, and manganese. There's some operations here and there, but bottom line, the U.S. is starting from scratch. China dominates because they have, over the last few decades, through the Belt and Road Initiative, really invested in places in Africa or Southeast Asia, other countries, to take dominant positions. So it was a very intentional policy move. So that's not something that can be corrected overnight. This is a situation where the U.S. has the advantage in that offshore, through companies like TMC, we actually have a lead on some of the Chinese contractors by several years. So the U.S. sees this as an opportunity to really jump back in the game for critical mineral processing and refining. So while the U.S. is catching up, the flow sheet that we are developing and have developed with Canadian engineering firm Hatch is very conventional.
Okay.
So the nickel, the primary way that we produce nickel throughout the world is a rotary kiln electric arc furnace line, RKEF.
RKEF.
You can also use HPAL, high pressure acid leaching. Let's put that aside. RKEF is the way that we intend to produce this. And in fact, we have a MOU, not a definitive agreement, but a agreement to explore possibilities of processing these nodules at an existing facility in Japan with Pacific Metals. So we've had that in place for several years. And in fact, we collected 3,000 tons of these nodules in late 2022. In 2025, we had a successful trial in Japan, and many people in the market attended that, including research analysts who cover our stock. We put 2,000 tons of these nodules through that rotary kiln electric arc furnace line and show that we can produce these valuable metals. So that's all proven. The question is, do we send them to Japan, or, pursuant to the executive order, is there an opportunity, pending U.S. government financial support, to bring it to the U.S.? So what you're doing, that's a long way of saying we're taking conventional technology, conventional flow sheet, and putting it in a less conventional place in the United States. And the reason for that is the U.S. hasn't built a nickel smelter in about 70 years. So the U.S. has just been more than happy to outsource this to China. We present an opportunity to change that and actually press the rare advantage that the U.S. has in seafloor resources.
I've got two quick follow-up questions on that. First, with that processing flow sheet, the technology, are you able to recover all the minerals from the nodules in a similar way? And secondly, in terms of building that facility in Texas or another place in the United States, let's say, how many years do you foresee to for this in terms of building this? Because it's, let's say, in terms of competitiveness, it's much more difficult vis-a-vis China in terms of building that facility in the United States.
Well, we would want to ramp up onshore to match the production offshore. So if we're commissioning that system in the fourth quarter of 2027, with production coming onshore then and first revenue in early 2028, we would want to move quickly. And while that sounds like a tight timeline, starting relatively small, we've already picked the site in Brownsville where we have exclusive right for a lease option. We're working with Mariana Minerals. Their CEO, Turner Caldwell, is somewhere behind me right now. They're taking effectively a AI software-based approach from all of the work they did at Tesla and their work in lithium and copper to reduce timelines by half and reduce CapEx budgets by half. That's what they're trying to deploy for a project like what TMC wants to bring to Texas. So we are confident that we can move quicker, and we want to be able to have first production during this administration. So that's why it's very important to potentially seek that government support, because TMC, yes, we're a 2.4 billion market cap company. We're not going to go out and try to build a facility on spec just on our own balance sheet. if we have the capital light option in East Asia. So I think the fact that we're spending so much time in D.C. and pursuing this underscores how seriously the administration is taking this.
Yeah. And I think another illustration is the push of this administration to streamline deep sea mining. You've applied for a US permit, a consolidated exploration and commercial recovery permit, which is deemed, I think, legal compliance by
fully compliant
by NOAA. You still got exploration contracts under the ISA. The permits, the potential US permit, is covering parts of the same area. Mm-hmm. I mean, we've discussed this on stage yesterday, also informally. There are legal risks, there are commercial risks. Mm-hmm. To what extent has TMC factored this in?
We, even before announcing our pivot to the US approach, we spent about a year really diving into those very questions. And it is crystal clear. There's two parallel regimes.
Yeah.
For anybody who, and when I say anybody, a sovereign state, who voluntarily gave up their rights in the freedom of the high seas to join the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea and join the International Seabed Authority, there are roughly 170 states who said, I will voluntarily allow the UN to do this, and then I will join this International Seabed Authority and I'll have a seat at the table. The holdout, one of the main holdouts, was the United States. The U.S. never ratified the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea. The U.S. never joined the ISA. So you can't apply a treaty to a country that doesn't agree to it. So for those 170 states, God bless, continue work with the ISA. We'll see you in the 2030s, whenever that mining code is developed. The United States actually put in place their own seabed regulations before the ISA ever existed. And in fact, if you talk to the Secretary General of the ISA for many years, Michael Lodge, he's very clear that, yes, the ISA took the U.S. rules and just tweaked around the edges.
So you're talking about DSHMA.
The Deep Seabed Hard Minerals Resources Act, put in place in 1980, that then gave the mandate to NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, to regulate this industry. So NOAA began granting contracts for exploration before the International Seabed Authority ever existed. So this is a firm, transparent, robust legal regime. But it's not something where, oops, they're in conflict with each other. No, they're not. If you're going forward through a U.S. entity, you go through the U.S. process. If you are pursuing a ISA contract and you are, let's say, a sovereign nation who has obligations under the UN Convention, that's a different story. But there's no conflict in that TMC, the ground that we're applying for through the U.S., is actually ground that other subsidiaries, Nori and Tamil, have exploration contracts with the ISA. So we don't believe there will be a conflict until such time as we actually begin mining through this U.S. process. Think of it as really a parallel belt and suspenders type approach. But there is no venue in which the ISA could say, well, we don't like this, so we're going to object or sue. The U.S. is not a party to the UN Convention. Okay. There is no legal venue in which the ISA could take that claim.
Yeah. And then perhaps a follow-up question. I mean, you talked about the commercial risk. So you seem to have factored these risks in. Do you foresee any trouble in, let's say, attracting more capital, potential future offtakes because you will need to sell those refined minerals to potential partners?
Yeah, I would say the main risk is perception. If you actually study the issue and spend a couple hours looking at this, it's pretty crystal clear that the separate parallel regulatory regimes, the U.S. has persistently been an objector to this UN Convention Law of the Sea Part 11 on deep seabed mining. That goes for Republicans and Democrats. This has been the U.S. position for over 40 years. I think what the NGOs and other opponents of this industry, look, there are many people who would not like to see a new source of supply. You have the NGOs who, of course, like Greenpeace, don't like seeing any new extractive industries. And then you have some people that are in existing extractive industries who might fund on the side to try to slow things down. And I think
countries like Chile and others.
So Chile is the largest, most vocal opponent in the International Seabed Authority, as they are the world's largest copper producer. France is the only country that is yelling the loudest about a moratorium for deep sea mining, because in 2023, President Macron had to bail out Eramet for the New Caledonia nickel operation. So they put more investment in that. Why would they then support a new source of nickel? So follow the money. It's always clear where those intentions come from. But it doesn't matter. There's no legal ability for a France or a Chile to stop the U.S. from pursuing permits and issuing permits under their regime. What the NGOs can do is try to, foment some disagreement and try to tell the media that there is this big disagreement here, there's not a whole lot legally that can be done to slow the U.S. down. What can be done is perhaps certain brands might take the easy road of saying, hey, we're not going to use metal from deep sea nodules. If they actually study the environmental impacts, they should be doing the opposite, because nodules present a way to lower your carbon intensity, lower your waste, lower your biodiversity impact compared to the same metal on land. So that'll all work itself out. It's very similar to the nuclear industry. In the 1970s and 80s, Greenpeace and others kicked up a lot of fuss about nuclear and why it shouldn't be used anywhere. And now looking back 50 years later, maybe that wasn't the right approach. And I think a lot of people are realizing that. They're taking a similar scare tactic in deep sea nodules. Eventually, public perception will catch up to the legal and environmental realities, and that's where I believe we have an airtight case.
Okay. But thank you so much. I think there is a lot that still needs to happen, but you seem to be very bullish and optimistic. So thank you so much, Craig, for this discussion.
Thank you, Bryan. Appreciate it.